September 15, 1950. 8,000 feet above the Pusan perimeter, South Korea. The roar of the Vought F-4U Corsair's Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engine was a familiar, comforting thunder to Captain Jake Rattler, Riley. His head swam, not with the adrenaline of combat, but the dull fatigue of another routine close air support, SAS, mission. Below, the dust and smoke of the relentless ground fighting. The desperate holdout, known as the Pusan perimeter, was slowly beginning to shift. The United Nations forces, having been pushed to the very tip of the peninsula, were finally gathering momentum for a counterpunch. Riley and his squadron, the Blue Devils of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 312, VMF 312, had dominated this airspace for months. They were kings of the sky, unchallenged by anything more modern than slow, easily dispatched Yakovlev Yak-9s or Ilyushin IL-10s of the North Korean People's Army Air Force, KPF. Blue leader to Blue 2, check 6, Riley's voice crackled, cutting through the static and the engine noise. He banked the heavy, gull-winged fighter, his eyes scanning the impossible blue expanse. They were searching for targets of opportunity, a column of supply trucks, an artillery battery, anything to further soften the communist defenses. The World War II-era aircraft, though relics in the grand scheme of aerospace design, were perfect for the low-end slow grind of ground attack. Their four 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons delivered a devastating punch to targets on the ground, and their rugged airframes could shrug off considerable small arms fire. The American and Allied pilots held a dismissive contempt for the quality of their aerial opposition. The KPAF was a joke, a collection of cast-offs flown by poorly trained novices. The U.S. Navy and Air Force pilots, veterans of the Great War and the demanding discipline of carrier operations, felt they held an unbreakable monopoly on both skill and equipment. The new age of the jet engine, they knew, was dawning, but its full impact hadn't yet been felt on this dusty, forgotten peninsula. The Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, was already flying reconnaissance and limited strike missions, a sleek, silent sign of the future. Yet, even the F-80 pilots often flew within range of ground fire, their missions relatively uncontested by enemy fighters. The pilots of the propeller-driven aircraft, like Riley, felt a smug superiority. Why bother with those delicate, gas-guzzling jets when the dependable Corsair and Mustang could do the job just fine? They'd joke at the officers' club in Itazuke Air Base, Japan. The assumption was simple and dangerously flawed. Air superiority was a given. It was a comfortable belief built on the past, but the future was already racing towards them at an unbelievable Mach number, cloaked in the red star of a new, formidable enemy. Major Ben Ace Carter, flying an F-51D Mustang with the 18 Fighter Bomber Group, felt that same overconfidence. He'd shot down a Japanese Zero over the Pacific in '44 and felt fully qualified to judge an airplane's threat. The communist air forces had thrown nothing at him that demanded respect. They were slow, predictable, and lacked the robust armament to truly threaten his metal steed. The war, to the pilots on station, was a shooting gallery, not a dogfight. They flew their missions, dropped their ordnance, and returned to base, their aerial adversaries an afterthought. This ingrained complacency, nurtured by easy victories and primitive opposition, was about to be violently and terminally shattered. A dark, swept-wing shape, forged in the secretive depths of Soviet engineering and piloted by skilled, silent proxies, was about to enter the ring. The sky over the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, was a canvas waiting for a bloody masterpiece. October 23, 1950. North of Pyongyang, near the Chongchon River. The cocky ease of the Pusan defense was long gone. Now, Major Ben Ace Carter was leading a flight of 4 F-51D Mustangs on a reconnaissance sweep far north, where the terrain was rugged and the threat of Chinese intervention loomed heavy in the minds of the planners back in Tokyo. The weather was crisp, the visibility infinite, and the mission seemed to be another milk run, a patrol over an empty sky. Carter's F-51, a piston-engine masterpiece of World War II, was heavily loaded with external fuel tanks for the long haul. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license as the Packard V1650, hummed a reliable, low-frequency song of power. Mustang leader to element, keep your eyes peeled. We're pushing right up to the Yalu today, Carter instructed, checking his oxygen flow. The Yalu River was the unofficial, but very real, line in the sand, China's border. Intelligence reports, though vague, suggested a significant buildup of air assets just across that river, a new kind of threat the U.S. hadn't properly categorized. Then, the warning. It wasn't the sound of engines, for these new engines were far quieter in a high-altitude pass. It was a flash, a glint of polished metal impossibly high above them, tearing a swift, clean line across the deep blue. Tally-ho! Way up high, 12 o'clock. Looks like jets. Lieutenant Tom Boomer Davies yelled, his voice strained with surprise. Carter immediately dumped his external tanks, the bright red containers tumbling away into the landscape below. He cranked the Mustang into a hard, defensive turn, his mind racing through the familiar propeller fighter tactics. High-G turns, snap maneuvers, and leveraging the Mustang's low-altitude speed. But the distance was wrong. The speed was alien. Whatever those specs were, they were moving with a velocity that defied every rule of engagement he knew. They were nothing like the F-86 shooting stars he was familiar with. These were sleeker, with a severe, unmistakable swept-wing profile. There were two of them. They did not engage in a dogfight. They simply dove. The attack was less a combat maneuver and more a vertical execution. The speed of their descent was terrifying, the whine of their jet engines growing from a distant mosquito hum to a howling, physical roar in the span of seconds. Before Carter could even bring his gun sight to bear, the lead aircraft flashed through the formation like a silver bullet, its wingtips trailing thin, ethereal condensation plumes. The shape was distinct, menacing, and utterly new. A blunt nose, a fat fuselage housing a Klimov VK, one centrifugal flow turbojet, and those aggressively swept-back wings. It was the McCoy-Gurevich MiG-15. A searing line of cannon fire erupted from the second jet. Not the familiar thump-thump of American .50 caliber machine guns, but the ferocious, explosive tum-tum-tum of heavy artillery. 23 millimeters and 37 millimeters cannon rounds, Soviet-issue armor-piercing high explosives, ripped into Lieutenant Davies' Mustang. The effect was catastrophic. The F-51's port wing simply ceased to function as an airfoil, disintegrating around the main spar. The aircraft immediately snapped into a corkscrew of death, Davies' last desperate call swallowed by the wind. The MiG-15s did not stop for observation, nor did they engage the remaining 3 aircraft in a prolonged fight. Their strategy was pure, brutal hit-and-run, maximum speed, vertical climb, overwhelming firepower. After the pass, they pulled up into the limitless vertical, climbing away from the pursuit like rockets, utterly outclassing the Mustang's power curve. Carter tried to follow, pushing his Merlin to the absolute limit, but the effort was futile. Within 30 seconds, the two devastating shapes were nothing more than silent, shrinking specks, disappearing into the altitude where the prop planes simply could not follow. Carter was left alone, flying in the shocked silence of a broken formation, the smell of burnt cordite and jet fuel lingering in the freezing air. The easy confidence he and his fellow pilots had carried into this war was violently ejected from his cockpit along with Davies' wreckage. This wasn't a joke. This was a technological leap. They hadn't just met a new enemy. They had met an aerial predator that hunted at altitudes and speeds they couldn't reach. The skies over Korea were no longer American territory. A new, terrifying shadow had fallen across the battlefield. Late October 1950. Far East Air Force, FEAF, headquarters, Itazuke Air Base, Japan. The shock reports from Major Carter's encounter and several other sporadic, devastating appearances of the swept-wing jet began filtering into the intelligence offices, but they were often met with a dangerous skepticism rooted in American exceptionalism. The consensus among the brass was that the early reports were exaggerated, influenced by the fear and novelty of facing jet propulsion from an enemy source. They had seen grainy photographs from post-war German captures and satellite intelligence, such as it was, suggesting the Soviets were developing a formidable jet, the MiG-15, NATO reporting name, faggot. But the prevailing attitude was one of dismissive arrogance. The Russians simply couldn't build a machine that could truly challenge superior American design, much less train pilots capable of operating it. The pilots who flew the older propeller aircraft, like the Mustang and Corsair, were the most resistant to the truth. They had always dominated the airspace, relying on their rugged reliability and exceptional low-altitude maneuverability. They genuinely believed that any new jet the communists wheeled out would be slow, unreliable, and an easy target, like the early straight-winged communist jets they'd occasionally met. They'd joke bitterly in the barracks, calling the new Phantom jet the Chinese goose or the flying barrel, a crude insult aimed at its portly fuselage. This internal mockery was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to contain the fear of the unknown and preserve the comfort of their established air superiority. Colonel Robert Boomer Henderson, a key planner in the 5th Air Force, was one of the few who immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. He stared at the newly compiled performance metrics, his face grim. The MiG-15 was not just faster than their current frontline fighters. It operated in a different dimension. The intelligence confirmed the terrifying reality. Powered by the Klimov VK-1, a reverse-engineered and improved version of the Rolls-Royce Nene engine, obtained via a controversial sale by Britain to the Soviet Union. The MiG-15 boasted an estimated top speed of over 660 miles per hour and a service ceiling exceeding 50,000 feet. The American mainstays, the F-51D Mustang, topped out near 440 miles per hour, and the F-4U Corsair near 420 miles per hour. Even the American jets currently flying combat, the straight-winged F-80 Shooting Star, couldn't reach the MiG's operating altitude and were considerably slower in a climb. "They've got us cold in the vertical," Henderson muttered to his aide, tapping a pencil against a graph showing the MiG's climb rate. "They can come in, fire off a burst of those monster cannons, 37 millimeters for God's sake, and be gone before our guys can even clear their throttles. It's a boom and zoom machine built for the stratosphere. Our prop jockeys are literally sitting ducks at 20,000 feet. The most immediate and concerning problem was the F-86 Shooting Star. Though technically a jet, its straight-wing design meant it suffered from severe compressibility effects at higher speeds and couldn't match the MiG's high Mach performance. The U.S. had a superior jet, the North American F-86 Sabre, a revolutionary fighter with its own swept-wing design perfectly suited for high-speed, high-altitude engagement. But the Sabre was only just entering service in limited numbers, tied up in the Air Defense Command stateside and in Europe. FEF Command had been dragging its feet, convinced the existing F-80s would be sufficient for the police action in Korea. Now, they were scrambling, demanding the immediate deployment of the Sabres, the only aircraft on the drawing board capable of meeting the MiG-15 on even terms. In the meantime, the pilots of the propeller-driven squadrons were left with a harrowing reality. Their job was to fly deep into North Korean territory, now known as MiG Alley, with the certain knowledge that if they were jumped, they had only two options: evade the initial attack and get low, or die. The mockery was wearing thin. The laughter in the ready room was replaced by a taut, grim silence as they strapped into their powerful, yet suddenly obsolete, warboats. The technological gap had become a terrifying, one-sided chasm, and the American air superiority was bleeding out, one propeller-driven aircraft at a time. November 5, 1950. 15,000 feet above Suniju Airfield, near the Yalu River. The mockery had indeed died, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. Captain Jake Riley, now flying his F-4U Corsair deep into the hostile north, knew that he was effectively piloting an antique. His mission, like those of many other propeller-driven fighter bombers now, was to hunt for North Korean and Chinese ground targets, bridges, supply depots, troop concentrations, tasks he was perfectly suited for. But the simple act of getting there and getting back had become a terrifying gauntlet. The area of operations north of the Changshan River and stretching up to the Yalu was rapidly acquiring its grim moniker, MiG Alley. Riley and his wingman, Lieutenant Billy Sting Stevens, were part of a 12-plane strike package, a mixed force of F-4U Corsairs and AD-4 Sky Raiders, the Navy and Marine Corps' ground-pounding workhorses. Their speed was barely 250 knots in their cruising altitude, a snail's pace compared to the new threat. They flew with their eyes glued to the upper sky, their necks constantly craning, searching for the telltale glint or the impossible contrail that signaled the hunter's arrival. The MiG-15 pilots, many of them highly experienced Soviet Air Force veterans, though officially disguised as Chinese or North Korean volunteers, were now operating with clinical precision. They rarely lingered. Their modus operandi was brutal. High-altitude patrol, waiting for the American strike packages to enter the killing zone, then a supersonic dive down at target speed, a quick burst of their heavy cannons, and an immediate zoom climb back to the safety of the stratosphere, or across the Yalu into the sanctuary of Manchuria, where American rules of engagement forbade pursuit. It was the perfect, risk-free application of overwhelming speed and firepower against an obsolete foe. On this particular mission, the strike package managed to deliver its ordnance on the target, a railway bypass. But the price of success was paid on the withdrawal. As the aircraft turned south, heavy with expended fuel, the air became suddenly electric. "Bandits! High-speed closing. 9 o'clock high," screamed the voice of a young pilot over the radio, laced with panic. Riley snapped his Corsair into a turn, his eyes searching. He saw 3 MiGs descending from 30,000 feet, looking like silver darts falling from the sun. The speed differential was staggering. The MiGs were closing in at an estimated 200 knots faster than the Corsairs could manage at that altitude. It was less a dogfight and more a firing drill. 2 MiGs bypassed Riley's flight, focusing on the slower, straighter-flying Sky Raiders. The air immediately ahead of an AD-4 exploded in a sudden, violent eruption of flame and debris as a burst from a 37mm cannon tore through its fuselage. The Sky Raider, flown by Commander Hank Hammer Dawson, immediately shed its tail assembly and plummeted. The second Sky Raider pilot jettisoned his canopy and punched out, but the third MiG immediately followed his chute, strafing the defenseless canopy and the descending pilot. It was a cold, unsportsmanlike, but ruthlessly effective demonstration of dominance. Riley pushed his Corsair into a desperate, turning dive, using the familiar thick air below 10,000 feet for advantage. The MiGs hated to mix it up down low, where the propeller aircraft could outturn them and their jet engines guzzled fuel. But even this wasn't a guaranteed escape. The pursuing MiG made one pass, its rounds kicking up geysers of water in a nearby reservoir, the 23mm shells missing Riley by a razor's edge. Then, just as suddenly, the roar was gone. The MiG had performed its signature zoom climb, retreating to altitude, conserving its energy, and leaving the terrified prop pilots to lick their wounds. Riley nursed his battered aircraft south, the memory of Dawson's exploding plane and the brutal execution of the downed pilot searing his mind. The war had changed from a confident patrol into a desperate struggle for survival. The F-51s and F-4Us were now merely bait, sacrificial lambs whose very presence was intended to provoke the appearance of the MiGs. The clear message to the FEAF was undeniable. The current stable of American air power was obsolete, and every mission north of the 38th parallel was now being flown on borrowed time. The need for the F-86 Sabre had shifted from tactical preference to strategic imperative. November 8, 1950. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C., and FEAF Command, Tokyo, Japan. The bloody losses of the previous weeks, especially the execution-style attacks on the propeller aircraft, could no longer be dismissed as anomalies. The clear, undeniable technical supremacy of the MiG-15 had pierced the veil of American overconfidence and sent a shockwave that resonated from FEAF headquarters in Tokyo all the way to the Pentagon. The strategic imperative was clear, sudden, and non-negotiable. The F-86 Sabre had to be deployed to the Korean theater immediately, regardless of logistical strain or prior readiness assessments. The alternative was the wholesale destruction of United Nations air power and the resulting collapse of the ground campaign. The F-86 Sabre, designed by North American Aviation, was a U.S. counterpunch, a direct answer to the high-speed German aerodynamic research captured after World War II, the same research that heavily influenced the MiG-15. The Sabre, with its own distinctive 35-degree swept-wing design and powerful General Electric J-47 axial flow turbojet engine, was the only aircraft capable of tangling with the MiG on its own terms. Crucially, the Sabre was optimized for high-speed maneuvering, featuring an innovative all-flying tail, which gave the pilot precise control even at near-transonic speeds where conventional tail surfaces became ineffective. The decision was made to strip the most operational F-86 Sabres from air defense units in the continental United States and rush them across the Pacific. The unit selected for this monumental task was the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, 4th FIW, one of the most decorated and experienced fighter units in the U.S. Air Force. They were ordered to prepare for immediate relocation to Japan, then quickly to Kimpo Air Base, K-14, near Seoul, as soon as that forward base was secure. The logistical challenge was immense. It wasn't just moving aircraft, it was moving an entire infrastructure. Ground crews, specialized jet mechanics, tools, parts, and fuel all had to be shipped across vast distances in a matter of weeks. The F-86 was a complex machine, far more demanding than the old piston engine fighters. Its deployment was a true logistical gamble, a race against time and a mounting toll of MiG attacks. Meanwhile, the existing jet units, primarily flying the F-86 Shooting Star, were struggling to maintain a presence in MiG Alley. Though the F-80 was an operational jet, its straight-wing configuration meant its speed was severely limited at altitude. Pilots quickly learned that engaging the MiG was suicide. Their new orders were effectively to serve as reconnaissance and escort for the propeller aircraft, absorbing the blows where they could, but strictly avoiding a high-altitude confrontation. Colonel Henderson characterized their mission grimly. You are there to scare them, not to fight them. And if they jump you, get low and run. The straight-winged F-80 pilots felt a deep, frustrating sense of obsolescence. They were flying jets, yet were still being utterly defeated by an enemy jet. The pressure on the 4th FIW was crushing. Pilots like Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, who would become one of the first Sabre aces, were intensely studying the limited intelligence on the MiG, dissecting its dimensions, armament, and estimated performance. They knew they weren't just deploying to a war. They were deploying to a test of global military engineering, a direct comparison between the cutting edge of American and Soviet design, built on stolen German science. The fate of air superiority over Korea, and potentially the future of jet combat doctrine, rested squarely on their shoulders and the performance of the Sabre. The stage was set for the world's first true jet versus jet aerial showdown. December 14, 1950. Kimpo Air Base, K-14, near Seoul, South Korea. The first detachment of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, 4th FIW, flying the precious F-86 Sabres, touched down on the frigid, windswept tarmac of Kimpo Air Base. The base, having changed hands multiple times during the fluid front lines, was a scarred, temporary outpost, far from the polished hangars they had left behind in the States. The air was heavy with the smell of aviation fuel, dust, and the lingering tension of a battlefield where the enemy was close. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, an experienced fighter pilot and one of the squadron leaders, stepped out of his sleek Sabre, the cold Korean air hitting him instantly. He looked north, toward the mountains where the Yalu River marked the boundary of MiG Alley. He felt the weight of expectation. They weren't just here to win dogfights. They were here to reestablish a global dominance that had been momentarily and embarrassingly lost. The pilots of the 4th FIW were immediately immersed in a very different reality than their training had prepared them for. They met with the propeller pilots and the F-80 jockeys who had been living under the MiG shadow. The meetings were somber. The prop pilots, like Captain Jake Riley, conveyed the raw, visceral terror of the MiG's speed and the lethal effectiveness of its 37mm cannon. The F-80 pilots expressed a different kind of frustration, the psychological toll of being outclimbed and outrun by an enemy jet. The intelligence briefings were relentless and focused on the enemy's strengths. The MiG was faster in a straight line at high altitude and had a devastating rate of climb. Its power-to-weight ratio was momentarily unmatched. The Sabre pilots were instructed to respect the MiG's vertical performance. "Don't follow him up," the briefer stressed. "He will leave you hanging like a clay pigeon." However, the Sabre also possessed key advantages, and the strategy centered on exploiting the MiG's weaknesses. The F-86 had better high-Mach maneuverability, thanks to its hydraulic flight controls and all-flying tail. Critically, it had a revolutionary radar-ranging gun sight, a 1cm, which used a small onboard radar to calculate the range to a target, providing the pilot with a precise firing solution. The MiG relied on a simpler, older optical sight. The Sabre was also a more robust gun platform, firing 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. While the .50 cal lacked the sheer punch of the MiG's heavy cannons, the Sabre could carry more rounds, had a much higher rate of fire, and the radar sight ensured far greater accuracy. Hinton gathered his men. "The MiG is faster in the climb and faster in a straight line. But we are tougher, we can turn harder at high speed, and we are more accurate. Our fight is not about the vertical. It's about energy management, maintaining speed, and exploiting our superior controls at high Mach. And above all, we fight as a team. No lone wolves." Their mission was clear. They had to fly deep into MiG Alley, the air corridor between the Yalu and the Changchan River, and provoke the enemy. The entire world was watching this aerial chess match, a direct, high-stakes collision between Soviet and American technology and doctrine. The Sabre pilots knew that the first encounters would be decisive. They had to win to break the morale of the enemy and restore the vital air umbrella over the UN ground forces. The stakes were nothing less than the operational control of the Korean sky. December 17, 1950. 25,000 feet above Sinuiju, North Korea, deep in MiG Alley. The sky above the frozen tundra was a blinding, pristine blue, the perfect backdrop for the violence about to unfold. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton led the first combat patrol of the F-86 Sabres of the 334th Fighter Interceptor Squadron into the heart of enemy territory. The atmosphere in the cockpit was a strange mix of tense anticipation and grim determination. They were the spearhead, the proof that the United States Air Force could still claim the high ground. The tactics were honed to exploit the Sabre's speed retention and superior dive characteristics, while mitigating the MiG's vertical climb advantage. They flew a fluid, finger-four formation, constantly scanning the sky for the telltale condensation trails that signaled the high-flying enemy. Bogies at 12 o'clock high, coming down fast. The radar controller, patched in from a ground station, crackled over the radio. Hinton immediately saw them, a flight of 4 MiG-15s, descending from above 35,000 feet, looking like black flies against the light. Their signature move, the high-speed boom and zoom attack, was underway. "Execute. Brake right, full power. Stay on the deck," Hinton yelled, throwing his Sabre into a high-G brake. The speed of the closing MiGs was breathtaking, but this time, the gap wasn't insurmountable. The Sabre was accelerating, its J-47 engine screaming, matching the enemy's speed in the dive. The MiGs, commanded by highly trained Soviet pilots, realized quickly that they were not facing the sluggish F-80s or the obsolete prop planes. These new American jets turned better at high speed, retained their energy more effectively, and were not easily intimidated. Hinton spotted one MiG break off its attack run too early, attempting to climb immediately back to altitude. This was the moment of weakness. "Tiger leader to 2, follow me. We're cutting his corner." Hinton rolled his Sabre hard and pushed the nose down slightly to keep his speed high, a cardinal rule of jet combat, known as energy fighting. The MiG was gaining altitude, but its turn was wide. Hinton sliced inside the turning radius, the advanced aerodynamics of the Sabre allowing him to pull a tighter, high-speed turn than the MiG pilot had anticipated. The difference in controls was immediately noticeable. The Sabre's hydraulic power controls gave Hinton smooth, predictable response, whereas the MiG, using an older control system, stiffened and became harder to maneuver at transonic speeds. He centered the retreating MiG in his A-1 cm radar gun sight. The system calculated the range, predicting the necessary lead, and the pipper glowed green, locked onto the target. Hinton thumbed the firing button. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted in a violent, rattling chatter, spitting a concentrated stream of high-velocity tracer rounds. The burst found the MiG's port wing route. The enemy jet lurched violently, a puff of gray smoke blossoming near the fuselage, indicating a ruptured fuel line or hydraulics hit. The MiG pilot, startled and wounded, instinctively pulled hard on the stick, trying to enter an uncontrolled spin for evasion. Hinton pressed his advantage, following the plane down. A second, sustained burst caught the engine housing. The smoke turned instantly black, and then red, as the MiG's tail section became engulfed in fire. The pilot ejected seconds later, a blossom of white silk against the dark sky. Hinton pulled up sharply, the successful attack flooding his cockpit with a rush of triumph. One MiG was down. The first Sabre versus MiG kill of the war. The rest of a short engagement ended without further losses on either side. The remaining MiGs, having lost the advantage of surprise and altitude, quickly disengaged, using their superior climb rate to retreat back across the sanctuary of Yalu. Hinton flew back to Kimpo in exultation, but with a sobering realization. The MiG was a magnificent, fearsome machine, and its pilots were not novices. They had won the first round, but the fight for MiG Alley was far from over. The aerial balance had been restored, but the terms of engagement were now defined by speed, altitude, and the relentless pursuit of technological superiority. Late December 1950 to January 1951. Airspace between the Yalu and Pyongyang, North Korea. Following the debut victory, the influx of F-86 Sabres continued, solidifying the presence of the 4th FIW and later the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing. The area north of the Changshan River permanently became known as MiG Alley, a dangerous, fiercely contested corridor that served as the primary battleground of the Cold War's aerial component. This stretch of sky was less a geographical area and more a defined technological and operational theater. The 300-mile-long, 50-mile-wide, high-altitude arena where the world's two premier jet fighters clashed daily. The arrival of the Sabre did not eliminate the MiG-15 threat. Rather, it channeled and intensified it. The Chinese and Soviet pilots, having discovered the limitations of their boom and zoom tactics against the more agile F-86, adjusted their strategy. They began flying in much larger formations, sometimes 30 or 40 MiGs at a time, using the sheer volume of aircraft to try and overwhelm the smaller Sabre formations, which rarely exceeded 16 aircraft. Crucially, they continued to exploit the Yalu River sanctuary, diving across the border after an attack, knowing the United Nations pilots were strictly forbidden from pursuit into Manchurian airspace. This line in the air created immense frustration for the American pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton and the other early aces constantly felt the sting of a fleeing enemy, finding immediate, untouchable safety just a few moments of hard flying away. The rule, imposed by the highest command to prevent escalation into a broader conflict with China or the Soviet Union, meant the MiG Alley was essentially a one-way shooting gallery. The MiGs could choose the time, place, and duration of the fight. For the propeller-driven aircraft, the presence of the Sabres was a literal lifesaver. Captain Jake Riley and his fellow Corsair and Mustang pilots were now flying their ground attack missions under the protective wing of the 4th FIW. Their missions shifted from desperate survival runs to controlled strikes. The MiGs, now occupied with the superior F-86 at altitude, were less likely to risk a dive on the slower prop planes, knowing a flight of Sabres was lurking high above, eager to trade blows. The threat wasn't eliminated. A lone MiG occasionally slipped through to savage the lower formations, but the constant, overwhelming aerial threat was managed. The dogfights in MiG Alley became a dizzying ballet of high-G maneuvers at near-transonic speeds, often exceeding 500 knots at 30,000 feet. Pilots described the feeling of control surfaces stiffening, the air resisting their slightest movement, and the sheer physical toll of maintaining consciousness during sharp turns at high altitude. The Sabre's greater turning capability and the revolutionary G-suit worn by its pilots often gave them the edge in sustained maneuvering combat against the hard-turning but physically punishing MiG-15. The Sabre pilots were rapidly accumulating air-to-air victories, and the headlines back home celebrated the restoration of American air power. But within the ready rooms at Kimpo and S-4 Suwon Air Base, the mood was focused. They knew every mission into MiG Alley was a trip into a technological crucible. The enemy was formidable, highly skilled, and enjoyed the constant strategic advantage of sanctuary. They were fighting not just a war, but a high-speed, high-altitude war of attrition, where the slightest error in energy management or formation discipline meant a fiery end. The initial mockery of the MiG had given way to a profound, professional respect for a machine that had fundamentally changed the definition of air combat. February 1951. Debriefing Room, 4th FIW, Suwon Air Base K-13, South Korea. The ongoing clashes in MiG Alley solidified the tactical and technological differences between the two premier fighters, shaping the doctrine of jet combat for decades. The American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15 were closely matched in raw performance, but their design philosophies revealed fundamentally different approaches to air-to-air engagement, which led to a fierce debate in the debriefing rooms. The MiG-15 relied on overwhelming firepower. Its armament consisted of two 23mm Nudelman-Richter NR 23 cannons and one massive 37mm Nudelman in 37 cannon. A single, well-placed burst from the 37mm could disintegrate an F-86. This was pure, brute force designed for rapid, destructive passes. However, the heavy cannons had a relatively slow rate of fire and carried very limited ammunition, often less than 40 rounds for the 37mm. This meant the MiG pilot needed to be extremely precise and economical with his bursts, a necessity often negated by the high-speed chaos of a dogfight. The F-86 Sabre, conversely, was armed with 6 nose-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. While a single 0.50-inch slug lacked the immediate stopping power of the Soviet cannon rounds, the 6 guns delivered a devastating curtain of fire with a collective rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. The sheer volume of lead was an advantage in a chaotic, high-G environment. More critically, the Sabre possessed the revolutionary A-1CM radar-ranging gun sight. This system used a small radar to track the target, calculate the lead angle based on range and closing speed, and project the accurate aiming point onto the pilot's windscreen. Major Glenn Stretch Eagleston, a highly decorated pilot now flying the Sabre, emphasized the technological edge of the gun sight to his younger pilots. Gentlemen, the MiG jockeys have to get right on your tail, within 500 feet, to make their optical sight work. We don't. Our 1CM gives us the ability to hit them from twice that distance. You get inside that firing solution, squeeze the trigger, and let the sight do the geometry. Our fight is about volume and accuracy, not a lucky cannon shot. The American pilots developed their tactics around this accuracy. They focused on speed and energy traps, using the Sabre's superior dive characteristics and high-speed cornering to get a bead on the MiGs as they either retreated or attempted a turning fight. They avoided the vertical, high-altitude climbs where the MiG had the advantage, instead forcing the fight into the 25,000 to 35,000 foot band where the Sabre excelled in sustained maneuvering. Meanwhile, the prop pilots, now flying under this jet umbrella, continued their essential ground missions. Captain Jake Riley, though he now rarely saw a MiG up close, was keenly aware of the drama unfolding thousands of feet above him. He remembered the feeling of being hunted and had nothing but respect for the jet pilots. Their struggle determined whether he and his Marine airmen got home safely. The war had irrevocably split into two theaters: the grinding, close-up war on the ground and the silent, supersonic war waged high above, defined by the two great jet designs and the stark contrast between powerful, slow-firing cannons and accurate, high-volume machine guns. The technology of targeting was proving to be a critical, decisive factor. March 1951. Pilot's quarters, K-13, Suwon, and the ready room of VMF 312, Itazuke Air Base, Japan. The sustained, high-altitude combat over MiG Alley began to extract a heavy psychological toll on both sides, transforming the aerial war into a severe test of nerves and endurance. For the F-86 Sabre pilots, the challenges were unique to the new age of jet warfare. They were flying at the absolute limits of human endurance, sustaining high G loads during maneuvers, constantly monitoring fuel consumption in the thirsty jet engines, and dealing with the constant threat of compressibility effects at transonic speeds. The environment itself was brutal. Operating between 25,000 and 40,000 feet, the cockpit was a silent, intensely cold bubble. The air was thin, the danger invisible until the last moment, and the pace of the engagement was dizzying. An aerial clash at these speeds lasted mere seconds. Victory or death was often decided in two high G turns and a single burst of gunfire. This intensity bred a specific kind of mental fatigue, a constant state of hyper-alertness compounded by the need for split-second, perfectly executed decisions. The pilots returning from missions, though often victorious, were wrung out, their flight suits soaked with sweat, their nerves frayed. For the older, propeller-driven pilots, like Captain Jake Riley back with his Marine Corsair squadron, the psychological stress had shifted from pure terror to a grinding frustration and a sense of marginalization. While the Sabres now managed the MiG threat, Riley's missions were still inherently dangerous, flying low through heavy ground fire. He felt increasingly like a supporting character in a distant, faster-paced drama. His comrades sometimes joked about the glamour of the jet war above, but the truth was they knew their time was passing. The sound of a jet overhead, either friend or foe, was a constant, humbling reminder of their own technical obsolescence. The older pilots felt they had been relegated to the mud movers, necessary but strategically secondary to the high-stakes chess game above. The MiG pilots, primarily Soviets and an increasing number of Chinese, faced their own set of psychological pressures. They were flying on foreign soil, often far from the support and recognition of home, under strict secrecy protocols. They had superior climbing performance, but the Sabre's radar gun sight and superior high-speed handling meant the kill ratio was beginning to turn decisively against them. They also suffered from the knowledge that once wounded, their chances of survival were low, especially if they had to bail out over hostile, freezing terrain far from the Yalu sanctuary. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton noted the change in the enemy's tactics in his personal log. They used to come in like a hammer, confident and heavy. Now, they're more cautious. They still hit hard, but they retreat faster. They've realized that the minute they trade altitude for speed with us, we have them cold. We've broken their initial confidence, but they haven't broken. This isn't a quick fight. It's a long, brutal war of attrition fought with speed and altitude. The atmosphere in MiG Alley was defined by this invisible pressure, a high-altitude war of cat and mouse, where the pilots were constantly testing the limits of their aircraft and their own mental fortitude. Every mission was a gamble where only the fastest, most precise, and most disciplined crew survived. April 1951. Airspace near the 38th parallel and the Iron Triangle. While the dramatic battles unfolded high above, the The propeller-driven aircraft were quietly, consistently, and indispensably winning the grinding war on the ground. The F-86 Sabre secured the skies, but it was the low-flying F-51 Mustangs, F-4U Corsairs, and AD-4 Sky Raiders that provided the crucial close air support, CS, that kept the UN ground forces from being overwhelmed by the renewed Chinese and North Korean offensives. Captain Jake Riley and his VMF 312 Corsair Squadron were flying almost daily sorties against critical enemy logistics and troop concentrations in the area known as the Iron Triangle, a hotly contested logistical and military hub north of Seoul. Their missions were perilous, demanding extreme precision at low altitude, where they were exposed not to the speed of the MiG, but to the sheer volume of enemy anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, and heavy machine gun fire. The nature of their missions demanded a different kind of bravery. They had to fly slow, often passing directly over well-entrenched positions to deliver their ordnance, napalm, rockets, and 20mm cannon rounds, with accuracy. Riley's Corsair, built ruggedly for carrier operations, often returned to Itazuk or K6, Pyeongtaek Air Base, peppered with shrapnel and bullet holes, a testament to the brutal, up-close nature of his work. Up high, you fight a ghost. Down here, you fight every soldier with a rifle, Riley remarked to a maintenance chief while examining a hole near his oil cooler. The jet pilots, though initially dismissive of the mud movers, came to recognize their vital, unseen value. Every Sabre pilot knew that the successful outcome of the ground war, and thus the continued deployment of the FEAF, depended on the CAS provided by the prop boys. The jets could clear the air, but the prop planes broke the enemy's will and supply lines. However, the risk of a high-altitude MiG attack still lingered. On one mission targeting a critical bridge over the Han River, Riley's flight was suddenly jumped. Not by an organized MiG formation, but a single, rogue MiG-15 pilot who had slipped past the Sabre patrol, looking for an easy kill. The MiG dove out of the sun, its appearance terrifyingly sudden, its engines screaming. Riley, reacting on instinct honed by months of fear, pulled a brutal, high-G splitus, hugging the topography. The attacking MiG, realizing it had to slow down to hit the elusive, low-flying propeller fighter, pulled up sharply, exposing itself. The MiG pilot was attempting to boom and zoom a prop plane, a tactic that demanded near-perfect timing. The unexpected savior was not a Sabre, but the ground itself. The MiG, unable to manage its speed effectively at low altitude, pulled too hard in the dense air, causing its controls to stiffen, a phenomenon known as compressibility. It momentarily lost control, the pilot fighting the stick, giving Riley a precious few seconds to escape into the cover of low-hanging clouds. The MiG pilot, realizing the danger of a low-altitude fight, quickly climbed away, unwilling to risk his high-performance jet for a low-value target. Riley landed safely, deeply shaken. It was a stark reminder that even with the Sabre dominance, the enemy was everywhere. But it also proved that for all their speed and altitude, the jets were highly susceptible to the terrain and the thick, lower air, the realm of the tenacious prop jockeys. Their work remained the cornerstone of the UN effort, a slower, bloodier battle fought beneath the silent speed of the jets. Mid-1951, MiG Alley and the R and our centers in Japan. As the air war stabilized into a daily high-altitude routine, the F-86 Sabre pilots began to dominate the air-to-air statistics. The combination of the aircraft's high-speed maneuverability, its robust 6.50 caliber armament, and the critical advantage of the A-1CM radar gun sight began to tell. The intense selective pressure of MiG Alley rapidly forged an elite group of pilots who mastered the art of jet combat, the American Aces. These pilots, many of them veterans of World War II's propeller dogfights, quickly adapted to the new demands of speed and energy management. Names like Major James "Jabby" McConnell, Captain Joseph C. McConnell, Jr., who would become the U.S.'s top-scoring ace of the war, and Captain Manuel Pete Fernandez became legendary. They were characterized by relentless aggression, supreme confidence in the Sabre, and an unwavering adherence to disciplined formation flying. The most successful pilots were those who best exploited the MiG's weaknesses, its poor high-speed lateral control and its tendency to lose too much energy in sustained low-altitude turns. The unofficial goal of every Sabre pilot was to achieve the status of an ace, defined as 5 confirmed enemy aircraft shot down. The competition was fierce, but it fostered a culture of excellence and shared tactics. Debriefings were intense, highly technical sessions where pilots dissected every maneuver, every gun sight setting, and every successful or failed pass. The focus was always on energy. Speed was life, and altitude was insurance. The skill disparity between the American pilots and their opponents varied wildly. The early MiG engagements were often flown by highly experienced Soviet pilots, but as the war progressed, the majority of the enemy flights were manned by less experienced Chinese and North Korean pilots. This shift was a key factor in the ballooning kill ratio, which by the end of the war would heavily favor the Sabre pilots, often cited as 10-1. The Soviet air doctrine emphasized ground-controlled interception and the speed advantage, often inhibiting individual pilot initiative, a stark contrast to the aggressive, independent doctrine of the American fighter pilot. The aces became the face of the air war back home. Their success is a crucial morale boost for a public weary of the grinding stalemate on the ground. However, their lives were a continuous loop of tension and release. They would fly dangerous, high-stress missions over MiG Alley, where a momentary lapse meant death, then return to the relative comfort of Suwon or Kimpo, or for a brief period of R&R, rest and recuperation, in Japan, only to fly north again. This cyclical exposure to mortal danger amplified the psychological toll, even for the winners. For the propeller pilots, the rise of the aces created a sense of professional pride and deep gratitude. Captain Jake Riley often heard the sonic boom of the Sabres above him, a comforting thunder that meant the high-flying hunters were doing their job. They were the shield that allowed him to continue his crucial, dirty work. The two air wars, the high-speed jet duels, and the low-level CAS missions were now linked in a perfect strategic symbiosis, both relying on the other for success and survival. The age of the prop fighter was ending, but its service was extended by the very jet that had rendered it obsolete. Late 1951, MiG Alley and the headquarters of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, 64 Shack, Soviet Union. The consistent losses being inflicted by the F-86 Sabre pilots, despite the MiG's technical edge in the climb and high-altitude speed, exposed a critical, hidden vulnerability in the communist aerial strategy, the quality and consistency of the pilots. While the American public was constantly fed stories of the rising Sabre aces, the Soviet and Chinese involvement was shrouded in complete secrecy, enforced by the highest echelons of command in Moscow and Beijing. The MiG-15s were primarily flown by the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, 64 Shack, deployed to air bases in Manchuria, most notably Antung Airfield, just across the Yalu River. These pilots were veterans and instructors, highly skilled, and specifically tasked with neutralizing the American air threat and protecting the logistical infrastructure of North Korea and China. However, to maintain secrecy and prevent the psychological toll of continuous combat in a high-risk environment, the Soviet pilots were flown on a strict rotational basis. They would complete a relatively short combat tour of duty, often just 6 to 9 months, before being rotated back to the Soviet Union. This rotational policy, while beneficial for Soviet pilot morale and deniability, inadvertently provided a significant advantage to the F-86 Sabre pilots. The Soviet units, despite their initial skill, were never allowed to stay in theater long enough to build the deep, institutional knowledge and combat cohesion that defined the American 4th and 51st FIWs. As soon as a Soviet pilot mastered the nuances of jet versus jet combat against the Sabre, learning its strengths and weaknesses, he would be sent home, replaced by a fresh, green pilot who had to learn the deadly trade from scratch. The American pilots noticed this inconsistency. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton noted in a combat report, "1 week, you're fighting guys who fly like demons, pushing the MiG to its limits. The next week, they're making schoolboy errors, breaking away too soon, or bleeding off all their energy in a turn. The skill level is like a roller coaster. This inconsistent skill level allowed the entrenched Sabre aces to rack up kills against the newly rotated, less experienced enemy pilots, further widening the kill ratio. Furthermore, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAF, pilots were facing a steeper learning curve. Having transitioned from propeller aircraft almost overnight, their training and flight hours were severely limited compared to the seasoned Americans. They flew aggressively and bravely, but often lacked the tactical sophistication and situational awareness required to survive a sustained engagement with a high-level Sabre formation. The secrecy also extended to intelligence. The lack of reliable defection or capture meant the U.S. pilots had only limited insight into the enemy's true identity, forcing them to fight an anonymous, professional foe. It wasn't until well after the war that the true extent of the Soviet involvement and their rotational strategy was revealed, confirming that the initial American dismissal of the MiG-15 had been a grave error, yet one that the superior, consistent quality of the Sabre units and their pilots had managed to overcome. The fight for MiG Alley was as much a battle of logistics and pilot rotation policies as it was a clash of jet designs. Late 1951, early 1952. Airspace over North Korea. The success of the F-86 Sabre in establishing air superiority forced the MiG-15 units to fundamentally change their operational profile. They could no longer operate with impunity below 30,000 feet. Instead, their primary mission shifted. Rather than dominating the skies, they focused on high-speed interceptions of B-29 Superfortress bombers and, most critically for the propeller pilots, finding small windows to attack the vulnerable close air support (SAS) aircraft. For Captain Jake Riley, still flying his F-4U Corsair deep into the thick of the fighting, the threat became less constant but more calculated and lethal. The MiGs would often patrol at extreme altitudes and wait for American jet escorts to be low on fuel or distracted by larger engagements. They would then execute a lightning-fast descent, attempting to hit the Corsairs and Mustangs during their ordnance delivery runs, when the prop planes were at their slowest and most committed. The FEF responded by tightening the F-86 patrol zones and developing a dedicated MiG cap strategy. Sabre flights were specifically tasked with covering the prop aircraft flying ground missions, flying tight, weaving patterns at medium altitude, 20,000 to 25,000 feet, while another layer of Sabres maintained the highest patrol over MiG Alley. This required immaculate coordination between the low-flying prop planes, the medium-altitude interceptors, and the high-altitude top cover. On one particularly dangerous mission near Pyongyang, Riley's flight was caught in a trap. A single flight of 4 MiG-15s dove through a gap in the cloud cover and a lapse in the Sabre coverage. Their target was obvious, the slow-moving, heavily laden Corsairs. "Brake! Brake! Hard left! They're on you!" Riley screamed over the radio, throwing his Corsair into a violent prop-straining turn. The high-G maneuver, a hallmark of the prop fighter, saved his wingman from the initial burst of the 37mm cannon. But the MiGs were committed. They pushed their speed advantage, trying to stay close and savage the formation. Just as the Soviet pilots were lining up for a second, decisive pass, the sound of their jet engines was suddenly overshadowed by a sharper, faster roar. The scream of the F-86 Sabres diving to the rescue. The Sabre pilots, led by Major McConnell, had spotted the attack and descended from their perch at nearly 40,000 feet in an almost vertical dive, exceeding 650 miles per hour. The appearance of the high-speed, accurate American jets was enough to break the MiG attack. The 4 MiGs aborted their run, using their superior climb rate to zoom back toward altitude and safety, unwilling to trade maneuverability at medium height with the descending Sabres. The rescue was a visceral demonstration of the symbiotic relationship that had developed. Riley felt a burst of adrenaline and relief as he watched the sleek Sabres streak past, their presence a silent, metallic promise of protection. The propeller aircraft, initially mocked by the very jets that would soon render them obsolete, were now dependent on those jets for their survival. The two generations of fighters, once rivals for tactical significance, were now fighting a coordinated battle against a common, formidable foe. The MiG-15 had forced the UN Air Forces into a technological evolution, but the result was a combined arms aerial strategy that proved overwhelmingly effective. Mid-1952. The skies above the Yalu River, MiG Alley. By the middle of 1952, the aerial war over Korea had settled into a state of tense, high-altitude stalemate, largely defined by the insurmountable political barrier of the Yalu River. The F-86 Sabre had decisively won the technological and tactical superiority debate. The kill ratio remained heavily in the American favor, and the MiG-15s were rarely able to operate south of the Chongchon River without being severely mauled. However, the MiG Alley corridor persisted as a volatile battleground because the Chinese and Soviet air forces had the absolute sanctuary of the Manchurian bases just across the Yalu. This rule, strictly enforced by President Harry S. Truman to prevent the Korean conflict from escalating into a full-scale war with China or the Soviet Union, meant that the Sabre pilots were effectively fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Major Joseph McConnell, Jr., who would ultimately become the only triple jet ace in American history, expressed the frustration shared by all the Sabre pilots. You'd chase them right up to the river. You could see the runway lights of Antung Airfield gleaming just across the water. Then, they'd throttle back, wave their wings at you, and coast to safety. It was maddening. This unassailable barrier determined the nature of every single high-speed engagement. The MiG pilots, even the less experienced ones, were always aware they had a quick, untouchable escape route. This allowed them to initiate contact at will, knowing they could disengage instantly once the fight turned against them. They used their superior altitude and climb rate to maximum effect, positioning themselves perfectly for a high-speed pass, but never committing to a prolonged, low-energy dogfight where the Sabre's superior handling and accurate gun sight would dominate. The primary objective of the MiG-15 now was not air superiority, which they had clearly lost, but harassment and attrition. Their job was to maintain a menacing presence, forcing the FEAF to commit valuable Sabre patrols to the north, thereby draining resources and preventing a complete cessation of aerial activity over North Korea. They successfully kept the B-29 Superfortress strategic bombing campaign so costly that the UN eventually shifted to lower-level, tactical interdiction bombing, often carried out by the propeller aircraft and the straight-winged F-84 Thunderjet. For the remaining propeller pilots, like Captain Jake Riley, the stalemate meant their role continued, though now more safely executed under the protective blanket of the jets. Riley's Corsair was still necessary for closing ground support and low-level reconnaissance, missions the fragile, high-speed Sabres were not suited for. He was a survivor of the war's beginning, flying an obsolete machine in the jet age. But his continued utility underscored a final, critical point. Technology had defined the high-altitude fight, but the demands of ground warfare ensured that the prop aircraft, once mocked, remained absolutely essential until the final armistice. The Korean War had proven that even the most advanced machine could not win the war alone. It required a complete, unified effort from every aircraft, from the fastest jet to the most reliable propeller warhorse. July 27, 1953. Panmunjom and the skies over Korea. The signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom brought the three-year conflict to an end, cementing the division of the peninsula and, crucially, concluding the world's first large-scale, sustained jet-versus-jet air war. The curtain fell on the stage known as MiG Alley, but the lessons learned in that hostile corridor of sky would define military aviation doctrine for the next half-century. The war had violently disproved the initial American confidence. The swift and brutal debut of the MiG-15, a testament to rapid Soviet engineering prowess, aided heavily by German science and British engine technology, had shocked the U.S. Air Force out of its post-World War II complacency. The propeller aircraft, initially mocked as the primary target for the MiGs, had been swiftly and unceremoniously rendered obsolete for high-altitude air combat. The initial arrogance that led American pilots to underestimate the MiG-15 had been paid for in blood and lost aircraft. However, the rapid, decisive deployment of the F-86 Sabre, itself a marvel of high-speed, swept-wing design, had successfully restored air superiority. The Sabre proved that technological advantage was only one part of the equation. The greater factor was the pilot training, the cohesion of the units, and the superior tactical systems, particularly the A-1CM radar-ranging gun sight. The consistent, high-quality training and rotation policies of the FEAF units had ultimately overcome the inconsistent experience of the Soviet and Chinese pilots flying the technically capable MiG-15. For the older generation of pilots, like Captain Jake Riley, the war was an end of an era. His venerable F-4U Corsair and the ubiquitous F-51 Mustang were immediately retired from frontline service, their legacy relegated to ground attack and transport roles in future conflicts. Riley and his contemporaries were the last fighter pilots to fly prop planes into combat under constant threat of jets. They survived because the F-86 provided the shield, illustrating that the future of air power was inseparable from high speed and high altitude. The legacy of MiG-Ali was manifold. Pilot G-tolerance. The speeds necessitated the widespread use and development of the G-suit. Gun sight technology. The clear dominance of the A-1CM radar gun sight ensured that complex fire control systems became mandatory for all subsequent fighter designs. The energy fight. The reliance on speed and altitude management became the central tenet of fighter pilot training, supplanting the slow-speed turning fights of the propeller era. Missile development. The challenge of hitting high speed, maneuvering targets with cannons in the high-G environment of MiG-Ali accelerated the development of air-to-air missiles, seen as the inevitable next step in aerial combat technology. The sky over Korea, though silent in the armistice, had been the forge where modern air combat was born. The MiG-15 had arrived as an unexpected, lethal ghost, and though it ultimately fell to the superior organization and systems of the F-86, its dominance during the war's early months ensured that the world would never again underestimate the speed and potential of enemy jet technology. The mockery was silenced, replaced forever by the sober reality of supersonic warfare.